So if you are just dialing in, welcome to the first governance call of November. Hard to believe that we're here already. We've got two items to discuss. I think the first one I kind of added last minute because I actually think it should be a relatively quick discussion item. It's a little bit more profiling oriented, but it's more for awareness and discussion with the group before we do any kind of further updates to it. And then the second one, so that would be like the modeling discovery. The second one was on, from a governance perspective, talking about, are some of our profiles that have undergone, extensive reviews, ready to kind of be bumped up in level, a refresh of what our maturity levels mean, and some decisioning about like how we make some determinations that something would be actually kind of ready for implementation at level 1 or level 2. So that one I think very squarely sits in the governance side of things and will be helpful for us, I think, if we can get some logic down for identifying, how much of our profile actually should be bumped up in maturity, since we haven't really done that in a couple of years. Was there anything that folks want to make sure makes its way on the agenda for today that we should talk about? Knowing, I think that we'll probably deep dive into like some of that reslicing discussion that we've had recently at the next profiling call. All right, if not, I'm just gonna go over the first one really, really quickly. It was something that I actually was doing some validation today, and I identified it at the same time, I think, as, Elliot, you and I were exchanging some emails with peers and put two and two together that some of our modeling in the JHN slice on patient may be more rigid than what was originally intended, and uses, I can show the group, effectively uses an element in FHIR that we call fixed to construct, hey, this is what a JHN typically looks like. However, the way that we've done it, and I'll show you how we've done it here in a second here. So we've got like this identifier. We've been talking about this slice for a while now. And the identifier is based on type. Or sorry, the slice is based on type. And we've kind of created this like fixed value to say, oh, well, the system's going to be this and the code's going to be this. And so in having some discussions around this particular, like how does identifier actually show up in the real world, and seeing it in some real world examples, what we're finding is that like this is a bit of a punitive like way of modeling if we're expecting real world implementations to include things like display for the coding or text to the coding. And so Elliot had mentioned that in talking about reslicing and in just looking through how we actually have it structured in our patient profile, we're kind of doing the thing that we want to avoid doing for that very reason. And it might have come from an assumption at the time that folks don't supply text or they don't supply coding.display. But I think what we are grappling with now is this reality that, hey, we've got more and more evidence that actually isn't the case. Some people do use display and some people use text, to go alongside the coding. And so I put in a ticket into our issue log, and I just wanted to get like folks' thoughts, like, we'll want to do, a little bit of exploration, but I think this is a pretty good candidate for the application of pattern instead of making it a fixed code. So that would effectively allow for going above and beyond what was stated in that this fixed piece here. But I wanted to see if folks were uncomfortable with that or had questions about like, what it is that is actually kind of driving some of the challenges here. So this right now is fixed. If we were to look at it in the JSON, you'd actually see there is this, where is it here? Fixed codable concept. And I think that the modification would be minimal. It would be pattern codable concept, but would probably be more in line to what I had anticipated the profile was supposed to be doing today. What do folks think about that? Is that surprising?
So I'm going to give other people a chance to talk, and I just did. The reason that I brought this up was not because, I mean, what I actually want to do is just use system and code, and for an MRN as well as for the JHN. But I found the current baseline when I sliced it to be confusing because what I was trying to do was to actually lower the cardinality on display and some of those other items by setting them to 0, 0, which they already were. And when I did that, odd things happened. Like I ended up with duplicates and things like that. So I think that the current implementation is potentially confusing for other implementers. And that's my only comment. Like I don't see this as being an issue. I see it as being potentially quite confusing. And slicing is confusing at the best of times. So
Yeah. I think there's like two things happening in parallel. One is the reslicing, and then the other one is there is a example that I was looking at today that actually, this was the first time I've seen an example that uses both display and text. Here, you can see it here. Or sorry, this one just uses, it looks like text.
oh, interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. So to me, like I read like, hey, there's this presence of examples that exist out there that would indicate there's a behavior in production systems to actually supply text. And regardless of the additional challenge of reslicing, the way that we've modeled the current fixed codable concept prevents this behavior in production from being considered conformant to our slice.
Exactly.
Are others like, have you guys, I was just surprised that like in all of the years that we've been doing this, this is like the first time that I came across this in an example. And like, I'm wondering if actually maybe this is more common than we knew.
What, putting the text there?
Yeah, or even just like putting the display there too, like system code display, because that's part of what's supplied.
Well, it might be you can't put display there and the text is the only option because of what us using fixed.
Well, that is what's happening today, but I'm saying in production, are folks naturally like orienting towards pattern to where they're either using text and display? And we just
Well, in BC, we're directly using the baseline in our conformance hierarchy, so we can't be using text. I don't remember seeing it anyway. I'm sure it would have come up in an error if
yeah.
that was the case.
My only other comment is that other places where I profiled coding, it seems pretty natural a lot of the time to use system and code mandatory and then an optional display.
Yeah.
Just for human readability, and not to be able to do that, I think is a bit of a shortcoming.
Yeah, I can see certainly in other codings elsewhere in the spec where you definitely want display.
The other thing that really confused me was everything looks fine in the differential view, and then I switched to the snapshot view and it's got little locks, and I'm like, where did these locks come from? What do they mean? And that's, I mean, that's obviously that's a my issue not understanding what the specification is telling me, but because I hadn't seen that anywhere else, it took me a while to figure out that that was coming from that from it being fixed.
Yeah, and it might be different, I think, maybe in simplifier versus other things,
Yeah,
the way it gets
probably.
like, so basically, like from a governance perspective, we have some evidence about people who are using it just as it is today, no problems. Some evidence where people might be using text, and that would be problematic, and a reasonable inclination that it's a pretty common convention to have display if you have a coding from a known system. Do we think that it needs further discussion to make the decision to go to pattern rather than fixed? Or is it something where we're like, yeah, we can understand that this is essentially more restrictive than what we intended in the baseline and have it be like a technical correction.
Well, is it the level that we're applying the fixed value? Because we're applying the fixed value to the codable concept.
Yeah.
Why we're not
Yeah.
getting, if you applied the fixed value at the coding level, you might not get that.
So
Well, that introduces other complications.
Yeah, probably. I've not used pattern very much, so I'm not gonna give an opinion one way or the other because I don't have the knowledge.
it's something that we can also, like, what I could do is before the next profiling call, like trial it locally with pattern and then trial it locally with the application at like the coding.code level. And like now we have an example of like, hey, this is one that actually a patient instance that we can test against that and see what folks think from there. But yeah, I wanted to raise it because I think it was just surprising to me that it took this long to realize that it was as rich as it was. Does that seem like a good set of next steps for folks to like kind of do a little local experimentation and then show the outcomes of it against the same example?
That sounds good to me.
Yep.
Okay.
And Piers, I'm still trying to understand your use case or what you're trying to accomplish. And if you can share your profile or your requirements, I'd like to look at it and see if the problems you're describing don't line up in my mind with the problems you're seeing. Or sorry, the what you're doing doesn't line up with the problems that you're seeing. So I'm trying to figure out why that is.
Yeah, I think I've got a couple different things that I'm struggling against. And the other thing is from a kind of a political aspect. The work that I'm doing is proof of concept, and it hasn't really been publicly announced yet. And I think that's happening fairly soon. So, I mean, I'm kind of keeping some of my cards
Okay.
right now.
All right. Understand.
So, I think that like from in the interest of keeping things kind of still at the governance level, we've got like next steps on this, and then we can kind of have some conversations offline once we've done some localized testing to see like, hey, does this make it any easier? Does this change the rendering that you're seeing? As a, potential next step on that front as well. I don't know why that just disappeared. 1 second. Coding code, I think is what it was. I think it's the 15th. Okay. Which brings us to the second topic of the hour, which is assessing profile maturity levels. So I will give us a quick refresher. So when we first developed the guide, we said, okay, we think it's valuable, given that we have a span of profiles, to try to not just identify a maturity level for the guide itself, but to apply a maturity level and communicate that to our readers on the basis of like each individual profile. And we based our leveling off of the established FHIR maturity model, like leveling system. And in looking at it as one of the kind of components of the guide that we should be reviewing and preparing for our 2.0 release, it kind of became apparent that like we've actually done quite a lot of work on some of these profiles since we first made the table and first got through our due diligence reviews. And so I think there are some outstanding questions that aren't immediately like answered in our FMM guidance alone that it might make sense to have us walk through. So I'm going to first show, I'm going to show you guys the table. You guys can see, I just switched from the, perfect, PowerPoint to the, this is just our CI build. And so this is like our all artifacts. So if you were coming at it from this perspective, and and you were to go table of contents, I think it's on this kind of this FHIR artifacts subpage. And then sometimes people don't see it because they jump right into the artifact list, which is the things that we've profiled. So as you can see, like, and at the time when this was built, having things that were a mixture of kind of 0 to 1 maturity level seemed reasonable enough. And then we also wanted to provide like additional context about activities that the baseline was undergoing to help contribute to kind of an awareness of why we profiled certain things at level 1 versus 0, and how much due diligence something had undertaken. But that the presence of substring review statuses and the presence of due diligence reviews weren't necessarily a one-to-one. They were just more like additive information to the profile maturity level and assessing, hey, how much has this profile gone through? How, like, and how do I compare it against others that may not have had the same level of kind of intense scrutiny? And so we also have, and I'll put this, I'm going to put both links in the chat. So here's the first link, which is to our table. And then here's the second link, which provides information on our FMM level. So we utilized the kind of the leveling directly from what HL7 publishes. The only difference I think is we made a modification of something that talked about like the FHIR, a particular FHIR management group, and modified it to like responsible working group. But for the most part, it's a direct lift. And for the purposes—
Didn't we also change looking for implementations to looking for derived IGs?
Let me see. I may not have called it derived exactly, but let's see, tested and successfully interoperability developed. Was it later on? Maybe I'm missing it. Implementer comments, multiple prototype projects, maybe.
Okay.
I know we talked about what would having tested it and, you know, supporting interoperability mean in our context, and that derived as well as implementing, like, or taking an instance and validating it against the baseline being another way of kind of determining, hey, has this been tested against a variety of system constraints. So I know that, like, so in that sense, like, the way that we interpret this has to be in the context of a base, but ultimately it's still within the boundaries of what HL7 has put forward and says, here's how you assess maturity.
Yeah, that one of my questions was how we're discussing review versus ballot versus formal publication, because we haven't actually balloted anything.
Yeah.
Um,
And so I think that where that starts to really have the most amount of impact is going to be FMM3, right? And
yeah.
my take is, at minimal, we know that there are some things that we have at FMM0 that we probably could bring up to FMM1 because of the bar is, well, the bar here is pretty low, but there is this substantially complete and ready for implementation that I think that we haven't necessarily said within our processes. This is how we determine that that's true. And so, for example, I've just pulled up like I was looking at like a couple of the things that are like currently marked level 0, but that have, you know, that have undergone review, that have undergone some due diligence, that like we don't have clarity in terms of, is that enough to be considered substantially complete and ready for implementation? And so let me see if I can actually have these side by side. So I think some questions that like we should work through is, you know, we know that some of our, actually quite a lot of the, you know, existing and the errors and the warnings that exist in the guide today are largely driven by things that are known and acknowledged. So like this first question of, this first piece, which is no warnings. I don't know if we ever documented to say, hey, something could be FMM level if it has a warning, but we also kind of have acknowledged that warning or error as known, and it's not something that we can actually resolve. So one example of this is almost every single one carries this error that's specifically around the publishing committee. But then there's some also that will have, you see, hyperlink warnings, for example. These are hyperlink errors that aren't driven by actual things in our guide. And so I think the question is like, do we all agree that if these are things that we say, these are acknowledged and they're either being resolved, like our canonical, or they're out of our control, that shouldn't keep something from being level 1?
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, even with HL7 International, you can go to publication, you can say things are normative, if even with warnings in them, if they've acknowledged the warnings and, you know, recognize what they mean. I believe you're required to re-justify at every publication. Because some of the warnings they get are due to tooling. And so if you're suppressing it, it might be that the tooling has changed and you should no longer be suppressing it.
Is anyone uncomfortable with this idea that like, hey, this is we should keep this as actually a barrier for us to be considered substantially implementable?
We're only talking about level 1, so I think
We're just talking about level 1, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, and then it's in the chat, Thomas, you said, if errors and warnings. That correction. So then the second one is like, there are some here that, let me see, that actually have had some substantial like review, like diagnostic report, have had some due diligence, but are still a profile maturity 1 and have outstanding issues in the issue log. So there's some that obviously need to be applied. And so like taking that off the shelf for a bit, because we obviously would want to apply those before we would up it in maturity. But there's some where it's like, some of these are for consideration, right? Around things that our community hasn't necessarily been able to discuss yet, but that we've kind of highlighted to say, hey, there might be some value in adding this in or providing clarity in our guidance around this type of scope.
Well, I don't think even international prevents you from having a level 1 that still has JIRA issues and things to work out, because level 1 is basically, yeah, we've got our first cut, let's start trying to use it, right?
Yeah.
I would expect we probably will still have issues. I mean, there's some things that you just want to fix, but particularly issues for consideration and things we're trying to explore and get user experience with, I would expect we'd have those. If we didn't, we should be more mature than 1.
Yeah. Or more implementer feedback on. Yeah, there's a few that are like this, not so much on diagnostic report, but like we definitely have some where it's like, hey, we've kept this open in the issue log with hopes that people will see it and respond to it. So does anyone feel the opposite, that like we should have everything at least decided on for it to be considered level 1? Okay. Didn't expect it, but I just want to make sure that like we're all in the realm of comfortable. And then the next kind of decision point is if it's been discussed and improved. Okay, yeah, so this was one for device. So when I look at device, we've got like some partial activity here in the sense where like the stream when it was originally going through device couldn't get through and didn't have as much SME engagement as we saw on like the clinical and the entity and the medication streams. And so we basically said like we got kind of most of the way through it, but we couldn't reasonably say it was at the same degree of SME review as the others. But there was a little bit of review done against an equivalent IPS profile. And we've also done quite a lot of, let me see, where's my device? Quite a lot, actually, when I looked at like some of the discussions that we've been having around, errors that we're addressing, as well as quite a lot in terms of like changes over time to like the device profile. This is just I think the first device profile. And so I think my question is like, even if we couldn't get the same degree in the beginning, and even if there isn't necessarily a ton of guides out there in the Canadian community, if we've had some discussions on it, like how do we determine if a profile like device meets, this substantially complete and ready for implementation? Like, we've got some community feedback on it. It's been 4 years.
I think we've got the issue that we still haven't got that SME type feedback on those ones. That to me would say, I don't think we're at that level to go there yet, because we've just done a first pass of general look at it, but not targeted look, if that makes sense.
And is there an equivalent kind of stance in HL7? Like, I know that there's a goal, obviously, to have subject matter expertise as part of the working groups that produce the actual resources themselves. But given that some of these are going to be more specialized, will device basically always be at a lower level if we don't have folks who are like hyper specialized in implantable devices?
Well, it's not necessarily you need hyper specialize in it, but you need like somebody who's actually at least use cases aware of it that can give feedback, because we don't have that with this group. And there's going to be other areas that are going to have the same problem where we don't have anybody who's got any real enough experience with the subject to give the good one. So we should have somewhere we get some. So for me, in my mind, to move beyond that draft state, you have to have at least some kind of feedback at that level, which we do for the other places, but not on this stuff.
So like at least one person?
Well, that's what I would look for, at least one. More would be better, but at least one, so we have some informed feedback rather than just us taking a wild guess. I mean, it'd be like us coming up with a list of codes to use for the doctor for diagnosis. I mean, none of us are clinical experts. We wouldn't be able to come up with a proper list for a clinic. So you need somebody with that information to come in.
Yeah, and some of it, like, I think philosophically, it makes a lot of sense. I think to date, we've been more comfortable with it because we inherited the device profile originally from like US Core. And so in some ways, like we had some preliminary, they were preliminary informed by the folks who contributed into those processes. But I think it's up to us to determine, do we also need somebody who does this in the Canadian context to have this be considered like, stable enough to trial?
Maybe we say that if we don't have that expertise, then we don't have business modeling it in the baseline and should pull it out.
Yeah, that's kind of where I was just thinking, as if with the general theory that we're designing stuff as it's needed, instead of in advance. I mean, if we've got nobody using this stuff and nobody looking to use it, so that we can't get input on it, then it really shouldn't move beyond that level until we start getting that kind of information.
So Elliot, what you said was maybe even have us pull it out. Randy, you said, well, it should, I think what I heard was it should stay in the guide and we just can't progress it.
Right.
Are there feelings about benefits or risks of keeping something in the guide if we can't progress it?
Well, it becomes a point too that if after a certain period of time that if we still don't get any feedback, that means nobody's interested in using it. So then now you can sit there and start thinking about pulling it out. But at the short term, like at the given the maturity level of of FHIR in general, I wouldn't pull them out yet just because we can't say definitively we're not going to use it either. Like once we know that nobody in Canada is going to use this particular profile or whatever, that's a point where you can sit there and say, well, we'll remove it.
Yeah, and I thought, for some reason, I thought we had had more closed ones, but it actually looks like this was the first one and it came from Elliot's initial QA of like the invariants. So this is like I almost think it's might have been like close to 5 years now. We've had one issue on device. Let me see if there's there's also another device profile, might be different. So I guess then the question becomes like, how long? How long do we wait?
That to me, I would say wait until we've got like the other stuff getting up to like was a level 4 range in general. But if we're still not getting anything on this, then that means nobody's going to be using it and we can drop it. Consider dropping it at that time. But that's just a gut feel.
It's
Whenever
sort of
you-
a judgment. It's sort of a judgment call based on what's going on and where, for instance, what things we're working on from the roadmap point of view. And like, I don't know if I could state a rule.
Yeah, so there is some that came from PSON and PSCA. There might be one from e-referral, but that one looks a little bit older. So what I'm hearing is we might modeling it and consider pulling it out of the guide. Once other profiles are at higher maturity.
The only risk I see about pulling it out though is if somebody comes to say, oh, I want to use it, and they say we don't have one, so they just grab Canada one and they don't talk to us or anything, then we don't know that it's actually getting used or anything. And so it becomes hard for us to start incorporating somebody who's actually using it here.
Yeah.
So it's a trade-off because I mean, if you do keep it listed and nobody's using it, you're carrying around baggage that we gotta kind of say, well, ignore this one. But at the same time, if you delete it and somebody doesn't want to use it, it starts making other implications that we don't really want to imply either.
Elliot, I think you were the person who was vocal about like maybe it makes sense to pull it out. Do you think that there's risk in waiting to like we're at like a maturity level 3 or 4? Pulling out something like device if between now and then we see like no uptake?
Well, it's if we don't have the expertise necessary to move it forward, the question is whether we're happy leaving it at 1 or 2 indefinitely. I suppose so. I suppose leaving it at 1 or 2 says, hey, we've got this here, but it needs some polishing. Don't take it too seriously. So people will at least recognize it's there. And that something could be done with it if they have problems with it based on their experience. So,
I'm just gonna go out on a limb. I actually want to see, because the other thing I'm thinking about that might be a bit of a risk is if we basically have only done very, very mild things to this, but the rest of the world has like US core, which we originally got this from, is maintaining this over time. One risk would be that we're getting out of sync with, if we're not maintaining it, that we might be getting out of sync with others. So this is slightly different. Some of this, see, expiration date.
Part of
Yeah.
the challenge, if you delete it, comes, how do you distinguish it's not in the baseline because we don't need to do any customization for Canada or versus something we just haven't had anybody to put the information in. So I mean, this
True.
profile said we don't need to make any constraints on for Canada, and we can use them as is from baseline or from HL7 International's level, right? But there's others, you know, if we haven't made that analysis, say we don't need to do anything, and we don't include it in here in any form at all, well, we need some way to indicate that it's only not there because we haven't had input.
Yeah, like one thing that I've always been kind of curious about and never asked is why there isn't a CA baseline profile for specimen. And I'm assuming it's because there aren't any changes required for the Canadian context, but I don't know. But it leaves me in a state of not knowing when I just don't see the resource that I expect in the baseline profiles.
Exactly, because it implies that, well, we didn't make any changes, so just use the baseline or that.
Yeah, exactly. Just use the base.
Well, yeah, and you could tell that a little bit by looking at, say, observation and diagnostic report, and if we explicitly reference the international version, that says that's what we're using.
Yeah, exactly.
Uh,
It's not immediately obvious. And nothing is.
And I mean, like some of that also, you can't help but have it be influenced by the fact is like, we started with a pretty large set. We haven't introduced another profile to it in 4 years because we're still refining the set we started with. But that doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't, like, there wouldn't be Canadian context applied to specimen. I'm sure there is if other Canadians are profiling it today. But there might be some scenarios where it's like, you know what, we assess this and we've identified we don't need anything different. And there might be others where this is a volunteer group and we just didn't include it in the scope of our initial release. And I don't know if there's a way to really fix for that, given like the nature of what of our community as a volunteer group.
It might be that we just need to put some kind of descriptor in front and say, these ones have been considered and we'll use as whatever without changes. And these are the ones we haven't considered yet because we haven't got the input needed to make a decision. And if you have that kind of a list where it's obvious, so somebody looks up one of those ones that we haven't decided on, then it becomes viable to, you know, as Elliot wants us to delete them. As long as you have a way of saying it's only not in here because we haven't had input on it.
Well, and ultimately, as a volunteer group, if somebody sees that and says, oh, I have expertise in that area, then we would hope that they could volunteer some time as well.
Yep.
So do you think that then like the compromise is it keeping device or profiles like device, right, that kind of fall into this, hey, we haven't really had a ton of SME engagement here, keeping them in the list and as profiles, or, and then just always keep them at a low level, or like having a section to say, hey, we tried to do this for device, but we really didn't get any engagement and any SME expertise on this. Not hosting the profile in the guide, but indicating on the table that like, we would love to be able to hear from folks and profile in the future if we do have that expertise to contribute to something like device. I think that's the alternative that might be closer to a combination of like Randy, what you're describing, and what Elliot's describing as well.
Something like that. I think we need. I mean, it might even help on stuff you've already gone through that, or the stuff we haven't even looked at all, that people are maybe considering using because we haven't even looked at. It might be useful to have that and say, you want input.
Okay, so what I'm hearing is at least a separate table with an outstanding decision about whether or not we'd actively remove a profile like device from.
Let's see, you can combine it with that list you have already. Saying that with the maturity level, and then we just list a bunch of the ones that we haven't looked at and just put it, instead of having a maturity level, whatever, just say we've got no input.
Okay, so instead of like having them be like specifically identified, just having a blanket statement to say, the ones that are maturity level 0 are ones that we have not had the level of input or SME participation to comfortably say that this is ready for implementation. So as a pattern statement, interpret it this way.
That kind of sounds risky. I mean, you can put that and then combine it with an explicit list of the ones we said that we've looked at and said we don't need to make any changes from. So then anything that's not in the list of ones we're working on and ones we've explicitly excluded are ones that we fall in that category of we don't have enough info to say. And so that means you don't have to go and search and make a list of all the profiles out there. You just have to list the ones we've currently worked on and then put the blanket statement to say, if it's not listed, it means we haven't looked at it yet and we've got no input on it. That might be the better solution overall. And then you can delete the ones that we haven't done anything on, like this devices. And
Okay,
at least
I'm going to circle back because okay, so let me get it on paper and then, okay, so it's indicate the ones we've worked on and need further engagement and SME participation. Plus statement indicating if anything not listed basically hasn't been reviewed.
Yep. And then another list of the ones we've reviewed and said we can use the standard ones on. Which then kind of makes it so that if somebody starts hitting one of those and says, well, actually we can't, and has some change, then they can come back to us and we can incorporate in the future too. So it sort of removes that mystery of why isn't this one listed?
So, okay, the third one is, and ones that,
The ones that we've looked at and decided we can use the standard ones on, that we didn't have to make changes to.
okay. I don't know if anything's on that list today, but I think we can capture it as a category, yeah. Okay. We can definitely put it as like a portion in the guide so that we don't have to have an answer underneath, but people at least know and can differentiate it. Okay. And then the determination around whether to pull something like device, I think is still outstanding. Like whether or not to keep it as something like this versus oh, okay. Actually, no. Device, I think, would fall into this category, right? We've looked at it, and for some reason we want to keep it. but need further engagement and SME participation.
Right.
Okay. Everybody comfortable with that? Device just being one example. I think it's probably the only one that was like heavily indicated. We didn't have, but like that degree of SME expertise available, and that really didn't have an equivalent DDR done on it. Okay. And then the last question that I had was, if we've done one, so the one that I was looking at was like service request. So we haven't really touched our service request profile. It had, you know, SME participation. It's, let me see if I can find it in here. I'm saying this just as a, this just provides us an example to work against. No errors or warnings outside of the one that like we've acknowledged. I don't think it has any major outstanding issues that need to be applied, but we'll check it. But it only had really one due diligence review at the time, and now there's more available to compare it against. And so I think the question becomes like, if we're kind of past the due diligence review stage, yeah, it looks like everything has been closed out on it. So we've had some community feedback and some due diligence against it. Now we've got the CSD, the PHSD, like the things that like will often use service requests, further enhancement of e-referral that's occurred. Do we think that we have to do more due diligence review before increasing maturity? Or do you think the fact that like, hey, we've responded to some community feedback. We have we had clinical SME engagement initially, and it doesn't have any of these outstanding challenges, is enough to consider it substantially complete and ready for implementation? Or does the like, because we're always going to have more guides and more profiles that are available to us as time goes on.
The question I would look at is, we've got EREC going. What changes have they made that really need to come back to baseline? And then, because that's where the most maturity work on it's happening, is in the e-referral project.
Yeah.
And so depending on what state they have it in, then you can take and say, well, that since they've made whatever changes, we should look and consider what changes start becoming part of baseline or not. And that's once that's done, then you can move it up clearly up to level 1 or higher.
So basically, like, if what we did, a due diligence review, has changed so substantially, like, and we can see that, then it might make sense to like to do a second round, just because we know it's changed a lot in the last 3 years.
Well, what I would put is not so much a second round of due diligence, it's just the more of getting feedback from actual use of it. Because in theory, the EREC is using that information to, with their work too, right? So as they're part of our whole environment, changes that are needed there should be considered, whether or not they're EREC related or Canada related. If they're more Canada related, then they should move into here.
So that kind of builds into my next question, which is like, level 2 is it's been tested and successfully supports interoperability against 3. So like, if something like service request is getting lots of feedback from a bunch of different implementer systems, and we are taking that same feedback and incorporating into the baseline, does this meet some of this by proxy?
As long as we've incorporated it, I'd say we get that. That's how you would get it to level 2.
Well, the other, I mean, comparator is like patient, which we've had like people in BC and like elsewhere that give us like this direct feedback, which is like, hey, I've tested my instance against it. I have incorporated it into my validation suites. I have reprofiled from it. Like, that's one of the ones where I feel like
Even
we'd be
higher.
the closest to directly meeting some of our expectations here.
Well, it might even be higher than that.
Maybe,
Depends
but then I think
how
about the
wide
problem we
your,
talked about today.
well, it really depends how wide you think your level 2 band is.
Yeah.
But for sure, the stuff that's coming through and showing up in patient summary and EREC, I mean, they're getting enough use that we should be able to start being able to push those up. That's tricky. But we have to get that feedback from those processes back into here to make sure anything that needs to get put in gets put in. And that's kind of a whole extra process that has to happen. And it's similar to the due diligence stuff, but it's kind of a different direction.
So for ERAC, service requests and ERAC. I think we got a lot of feedback in PSCA for patient.
Practitioner and
Like, is this controversial? Like, is this a controversial statement to anyone? Like, that we might be able to consider if we are, like, we're looking at the feedback that's been received, we look at like the ballot feedback that came in for ERAC or the ballot feedback that came in from PSCA, and we actively incorporate it with the intention of, hey, a community member raised this and we had the same problem in our profile, that can constitute some degree of testing because it's the same rule. Assuming that we go and do this, we haven't done that for service request yet.
really, there's a bunch of profiles you can look at. Almost everything used in patient summary, the same kind of consideration can apply to.
Yeah.
I just see currently the stuff in EREC is not, because EREC isn't that firm yet. As to whether or not I used to say they're all ready to go, but some parts are. And so
So do you think it's like guides that have gone through what, at least like 2 or 3 other cycles?
in my mind, that's enough, but what's everybody else think?
It seems reasonable.
Yeah, and again, I think it's just like, this is level 2, right? So it's the equivalent of like, if it only took, folks that were testing against the profile in like a completely synthetic environment. I think feedback from production environments that have like gone through a number of cycles seems to be at or above that level of expectation. So are there anywhere, oops, I don't know why that's doing that. So like ones that we think might be good candidates for like doing this, hey, incorporation of any subsequent feedback. Like I think patient, practitioner roles gone through quite a bit. What else? Medication's gotten quite a lot in the PSCA world, allergy condition. Does that mean that those might be candidates? Like if we bring them, so we've got to get 1.2 out, but if the idea is part of 2.0 is to update and do overall QA cleanup, that like maybe we do a quick scan and make sure that like we're aligned, and any of the feedback that's come through from like the formal feedback cycles makes its way into the baseline if it hasn't been addressed for consideration of upping those.
Yep.
Okay. So ahead of two. Some of the profiles that meet this criteria and ensure that it's been incorporated. Do we think we have to like actively like ask, like bring it back? So after we've like confirmed it, bring it back to governance and say, yay, nay, we're good at patient going to 2, we're good at provider going to 2, or practitioner. Like the official decisioning made by profile level at the governance.
It would probably be good to at least get people feeling comfortable with it at that point.
Okay. So instead of, I'll say just before bringing it to gov to sign off on the updates, to basically say, like, we'll probably have a couple sessions where we're like, these are the ones that get bumped up. Here's the reason why. The next session will be the next round. All right. Am I missing anything that we should make sure we talk about, like in the maturity reassessment?
Probably, but we won't see it until we start trying.
Yeah, that's true. All right, so I will put a pause on that for today. And we will pick up on the profiling conversations next Friday. And again, we've got a ton in looking at what's in the issue log. We've got so much still that's ready to apply. So if there's anyone who's interested in throwing their hat in the ring, making some of these like changes into the CI build, it would be much appreciated. All right. Thanks, folks. Talk soon.
Great weekend, everybody.
Yep, you too.
Thank you.
Bye.